All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are on episode 100. That's an accomplishment. Episode 100 of Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen, and we're beginning part 2, Cabrini Green, Harlem Watts Jackson. All right, chapter 6, Cabrini Green Rap. Annie Ricks. Annie Ricks was born on August 1st, 1956 in Riverview, Alabama, the youngest of her mother's 10 children. They lived in a one-room cabin, and Annie and her siblings arranged their narrow beds like jigsaw pieces around a potbelly stove. They had an outhouse, a slop jar, a well from which the children told water for cooking and cleaning. Her mother took care of a white minister's family, earning $2 a day, working 7 days a week. The Ricks children wore the hand-me-downs from the minister's flock. The Riverview was a mill town on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, bordering Georgia. While Annie was growing up, there were separate schools for whites and blacks, separate parks, libraries, hospitals, and cemeteries. Annie would live in Chicago for almost 50 years and never once returned to Alabama, even after Riverview and 3 other mill towns were incorporated to form a new city and their names and segregated schools were no more. Quote, I told my own children they were blessed they didn't know about whales and snakes and the real prejudiced Jim Crow law, end quote, Ricks would say. A constellation of freckles dotted the bridge of Annie's nose and reached her high cheekbones, which would sharpen the points each time she announced with a sly smile, quote, but I can't be mad, end quote. It was something she'd repeat her entire life, a calming mantra for whenever she felt adrift in the dark waters of a rage. She didn't know her father. He'd left when Annie was 6 months old. At bring your dad to school days, she just said he was dead, which to her he was. Quote, you know you're stubborn, end quote, her teacher said. Quote, yes, ma'am, end quote. Her mother would tell her, quote, you're the strongest of my kids, end quote. When Annie was 6, her uncle died, and the body was laid out in the front room of her aunt's house. Annie's sisters wept. One of them tore up her only pair of shoes on purpose to get out of going to the funeral. But Annie stared at her uncle without emotion until the casket was closed. She figured he'd had to be in a better place. Annie's oldest brother was the first to leave for Chicago. When he settled into a job, he sent for their mother. Annie, being the baby, made the journey next. It was 1967, and the cousin and her husband were back in Alabama, visiting from Chicago. They let 10-year-old Annie ride with them on the return trip north. The cousin was also named Annie, and everyone in the family called her, quote, Little Annie, end quote, and Ricks by her middle name, Jeffrey. For the drive, Ricks put on her best dress and had her hair pressed. They rode through the night, reaching Chicago in an early morning downpour, stopping first at Little Annie's South Side apartment. To Ricks, it looked like her cousin had struck it rich. The tidy apartment had a shiny stove and wood cabinets and an indoor bathroom with a sink, a flush toilet, and a bathtub that included a curtain and a shower. Quote, Jeffrey, you want to take a bath? End quote, her cousin offered. Quote, yes, ma'am, end quote. Little Annie turned on the tap, and Ricks watched gape-mouthed as streaming water poured out. She luxuriated in the hot bath, soaking and submerging and twisting for a full hour. Then her cousin fixed her a breakfast of eggs, toast, grits, and rice, her first meal as a Chicagoan. After she ate, Ricks asked if it might be possible for her to take another bath. The second one lasted longer than the first. Within a year, the other Ricks children had followed Annie to Chicago. Their mother found a place for them in North Lawndale, a West Side neighborhood that had recently made the transition from a population of 100,000 whites to one of 100,000 blacks. A couple of generations worth of shifting demographics time-lapsed into a few turns of the seasons. They lived on the top floor of a 3-story walk-up in a 3-bedroom apartment with a big kitchen, a living room, and a balcony. Rick's mom would tell them, quote, don't let the street lights catch you, end quote, and Annie knew to be home each night before dark. But then she stepped onto the balcony and chat with friends whose parents were less confining in their rules. That's how Annie met Ernest Roger Bryant. His family lived in a similar walk-up a couple of doors down. She'd whistle, and Ernest would appear at his window. They talked for hours. He was 2 years older, and they started going together when Annie was 12. He'd pluck at her golden afro, teasing that it wasn't her real hair. Quote, "You know what happens when you lie down?" End quote, her mother asked one day. Annie says she knew, but her mother meant it less as a question than as a warning. And when Annie was 15 and draping herself in her brother's oversized shirts, her mother knew what was up. Rix gave birth to a boy, and they named him after Ernest. When she returned to 10th grade, a couple of months later, Annie's mother watched the baby during the day. In her senior year, Annie became pregnant with her and Ernest's second child and left school for good. Leap ahead a few years to the tail end of the 1980s, and Annie and Ernest haven't traveled far from the West Side block where they met. They rented the second floor of a house just around the corner. Rix was 33, and she and Ernest now have 5 boys: Ernest, Shannon, Cornelius, Kenton, and Erskine, named for Inspector Louis Erskine, a character from the TV show The FBI, and 3 girls: Kenosha, whose name came not from the neighboring Wisconsin town, but from the first initial of 7 of Annie's closest friends, Latasha and Ernestine. Rose, Deontay, Reggie, Raymond, and Raekwon would come later. The neighborhood had undergone its own changes. International Harvester, Sunbeam, the giant Hawthorne plant of Western Electric, Zenith, the Sears headquarters, and many other manufacturers and retailers had shut their doors, tens of thousands of jobs gone, with most of the smaller businesses making an exit as well. Just 1 supermarket and 1 bank remained. The neighborhood lost half its population, and it would have again in the coming decades. But Rix had a job not far away in a factory molding plaster figurines. She enjoyed the work. Quote, "I enjoy everything that I do," end quote, she liked to declare. Annie believed that if she followed the rules, if she kept up her part in whatever contract she signed, then she was entitled to all that was promised her. Their landlord lived on the first floor, and when the rent was due each month, she paid it. When something in their unit broke, the landlord fixed it. That was how the arrangement was supposed to work. So they all got along fine. One afternoon that fall, Rick saw the landlord arguing with the man in front of the 2 flat. She didn't know what about, but she figured later that it was that man who torched their place. Annie's brother was staying with them, and that night, while they were asleep, he was the first to smell the smoke and yell for everyone to wake up. They collected the children and scrambled onto the sidewalk, managing to grab a few framed pictures and toys on the way out. A half-asleep Latasha, hoping to curl in bed, was on her way back through the front door when somebody saved her a second time that night. Then from the yard, they watched as their home and everything in it burned. They tried staying at a cousin's apartment and then another cousin's place. Rix bought groceries, took her younger relatives with them to a diner, but even family could only do so much. She came with a mob of kids, so many that they seemed to fill every space. When they spent the night, they covered the floor like a carpet. You couldn't put a foot down without stepping on one of them. Some nights, Rix found herself herding her children along West Side streets with no place to go. They walked a mile east to Cook County Hospital and huddled in the lobby. Other families were there, too, and Rix kept watch as her children slept. When Annie considered her predicament, the fact of it baffled her. She knew parents who were dope fiends and deadbeats, their children unkempt and uncared for. That wasn't her at all. She'd been providing since she was a teenager. Her children were well fed and neatly dressed, their hair combed and cut and braided. She made sure they finished their homework and were on time for school. She volunteered in their classrooms and attended their basketball games. When they pleaded for Air Jordans, she made sure they weren't the ones among their teammates to go without the shoes. So how could she not have a place for them to spend the night? The word describing her situation that applied to her simply didn't make sense. Annie Jeffrey Rix was homeless? Without a permanent address, she lost her public aid. At her lowest, she asked a social worker at the public hospital to take her children, figuring they'd be better off in foster care, at least until she straightened out her housing mess. But the social worker refused. Quote, "Look how good these children are doing," end quote, the woman said. So Ricks divided up her family, parceling off the children to different relatives, keeping a couple here and a couple there. One of Ricks's sisters had a job at Sears. A brother worked in a pickle factory. Two other brothers found service jobs at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and one of them was able to buy a bungalow in Marquette Park, where Martin Luther King had been attacked, and which was now well on its way to being largely black, Latino, and Arab. All Annie's siblings worked, and none of them, at that point, lived in public housing. But Annie was desperate and in need of what President Truman had described as every American's right to, quote, "a decent home and a suitable living environment," end quote. She applied for a CHA apartment. She put down as her first choice Lawndale Gardens, a development of 128 units in a 2-story row home not far from her on the west side. Her second choice was the Henry Horner Homes, a much larger complex on the near west side. Cabrini Green was third. On a December morning, amid a snowstorm, she let her third oldest son, Cornelius, stay home from middle school. They were on the city's western edge, almost to the suburb of Oak Park, and Cabrini Green was 7 miles away. The CHA hadn't responded to her application yet, but Ricks had heard that there were openings at Cabrini. She told Cornelius they were going to get their apartment that day, and they were going to walk. In the snow, they started the journey by heading east on Harrison Street in the direction of downtown with the hazy Sears Tower hovering in the distance. They passed churches and parks, a police station, and a checkerboard of overgrown empty lots now coated in white. They walked for an hour, and then another. Cornelius knew better than to complain to his mother about sore feet and cold hands. She sometimes walked on her own for entire evenings, and there was no dissuading her when her mind was set. They reached Ogden Avenue, that diagonal street designed to give white West Siders easy access to the lakefront. Ricks and her son walked it for another hour. They took Ogden as it spanned the Chicago River and continued over a valley of rail lines and factories. East of the river's north branch, at 1230 North Burling Building, the elevated roadway came to a blockaded dead end. They were still a mile from Lake Michigan. That's where Annie and Cornelius descended a flight of stairs. They'd made it to Cabrini Green. A woman at the housing office half listened as Ricks detailed her plight, not seeming to care that they had trudged through the snow all the way from the west side. The woman said no apartments were available, which was as much true as it wasn't. The Cabrini row houses were almost completely full, but a third of the red high-rise units were unoccupied and almost half of the white ones. The CHA hadn't fixed up and readied them for occupancy. The agency said it couldn't afford to do the repairs to rent the empty units, and not just at Cabrini Green, but at public housing all over the city. Ricks dismissed the woman's words with a wave of her hand. She didn't want to hear about the budgets or the agency's problem. To her, the math was simple. 1,200 apartments at Cabrini Green with no one in them, and she and her children burned out of their West Side home, wandering the streets, sleeping in a hospital lobby, needing just one. Quote, "No, ma'am," end quote, she said. She motioned for Cornelius to take a seat. They weren't going anywhere. Ricks could pester, persist, accuse, as if on a loop. She announced that she was about to raise some hell. She was going to call all the TV news networks, channels 2, 5, 7, and 9. She started naming the journalists who'd be interviewing her. Walter Jacobson, Ron Majors, Oprah. Quote, "Why lie and say you don't have an apartment for my family? I know you have an apartment. There are so many apartments here," end quote. Ricks cut herself short, a look of surprise suddenly giving way to a self-preserving grin. Quote, "But I can't ever be mad," end quote. By then, though, the woman at her desk was relenting. She sent Ricks to one of the white high-rises next door to Dolores Wilson's building. The tower at 660 West Division was a 15-story plain box, a giant filing cabinet with a facade the color of cigarette-stained teeth. The elevators were out of order and the stairwells were dark. The fifth-floor apartment Ricks entered looked like a crypt. Plywood covered the windows. Trash and old clothes were clustered along the floorboards like blown leaves. The kitchen cabinets dangled or were missing altogether. Ricks surveyed the rundown surroundings, counting 4 bedrooms. There was a full bathroom on one side of the unit and a half bath on the other. The front room was large enough for a dining table and a sofa, and it was connected to the kitchen, which, she checked, had a working stove and refrigerator. The ceilings were high, the walls made of seemingly indestructible cinder block. She smiled. What Annie Ricks saw looked like a home. All right, and that brings us to a changing of the theme in the chapter. And what stands out to me in that passage is, again, the Great Migration that Black people dealt with in the 20th century. We read in the first passage about families coming from the South and moving to the Midwest, moving to Illinois, moving to Chicago. And one of the things that I pointed out then is that you have to remember these people who are moving from the South to these different regions of the country are not coming there. They're not coming there as blank slates. They're coming there already traumatized from the effects of living in the South, whether it be the police terrorism that was in the South or the Ku Klux Klan terrorism that was in the South, the white supremacist, white nationalist terrorism that existed in the South, the dealing with the ramifications of the Jim Crow that existed in the South, dealing with the ramifications and the residual effects of the destruction of Reconstruction that existed in the South. And so I think that's something that always has to be put into context, is that these people that we are reading about are traumatized people for multiple generations. The generation right before the generation that was moving in the Great Migration will be the first generation removed from slavery. And then their parents would have been born into slavery. And so I think that is something that you have to continue to keep in the back of your mind as we read about these things, is that is still that how close these people are to slavery, how close these people are to the Jim Crow segregation, and how that affects not only their decision making, but how that affects psychologically their existence. And then another thing that just stands out again is the divestment that was done into these communities once Black people began to live in them. It's not a coincidence that as some of these areas begin to be more Black and begin to have more Hispanic members in the community, and they talked about Arabs moving in the community too. It's not a coincidence that it was divestment done to those communities. It's not a coincidence that the public housing that was predominantly being used by Black people was not being kept up. That it was, and again, we're reading this, and Annie Ricks is talking about being homeless, and as she's being homeless in Chicago, the CHA is actively letting homes not be kept up for people to be able to move in and live in them. And so those are all things that I just think we have to think about. And again, remembering that this is not something that is exclusive to Chicago, even though that the case study we are looking at right now is Chicago, and the specific case study in Chicago is Cabrini Green. These are things that have happened to public housing countrywide. Ricks knew very little about Cabrini Green or its reputation when she moved in with her family. She hadn't watched Good Times or Cooley High. She wasn't living there yet in 1983 when a documentary on the Jesse White tumblers, the ambassadors of Cabrini, aired on TV, contrasting the development's perilous streets and fatigued stairwells with the militarized grace of these athletes leaping and flipping and somersaulting. Quote, most of the young little white kids, they grow up, their mother can send them to a school, or they can take up gymnastics, use all the apparatus, or go to swimming. So they can take up ballet, end quote. A young Jesse White tumbler named Marcus says in the film, quote, we don't have money to do that. If we had what they had, we'd be equal. But we can't be equal without nothing to help us out, end quote. Ricks would soon get to know many of the 200 Cabrini residents who were interviewed for the Free Street Theater's musical project. And she'd meet Dolores Wilson, who served on the Free Street Theater's board. Project, from 1985, mixed sketches and original songs with testimonials from Cabrini Green tenants displayed on 70 monitors stacked on the stage to look like the red and white high-risers. An actor rapped, quote, "Cabrini means red and green is white. And if you want to stay alive, you better get that right," end quote. Ricks hadn't seen the reoccurring Saturday Night Live skit from around the same time featuring a teenage single mother named Cabrini Green Harlem Watts Jackson. Especially after Mayor Burns' stay, the housing development had entered the pantheon of proper names of scariest places in America. The character, played by Denitra Vance, the show's only black female cast member, wore pigtail braids and a t-shirt tucked into a miniskirt. Quote, "I was at home. My mama was fixing some cornbread, black-eyed peas, candied yams with neck bones, and some Kraft macaroni and cheese," end quote, Cabrini Green Harlem Watts Jackson relates. Quote, "I said, 'Hi, mama. You want to hear a joke? I'm pregnant.' She said, 'How did that happen?' I said, 'How am I supposed to know how that happened? You never told me nothing about things like that. The school don't teach us about things like that. You're asking me how that happened?" End quote. The week Oprah Winfrey traveled from Chicago to guest host Saturday Night Live, she played both the slave of SNL producer Lorne Michaels and the mother of Cabrini Green Harlem Watts Jackson. That's fucking nuts. I'm going to have to look that shit up after I get off it. Man, my fault. That's nuts, though. All right. Ricks did have a brother-in-law who worked at the giant Montgomery Ward warehouse behind the Cabrini row houses. He told Annie that people at Cabrini Green were shooting, but that didn't mean anything to her. People were shooting on the west side. People were shooting on the south side. Quote, "Because I hadn't heard of Cabrini Green, I came to it fresh," end quote, she would say. Ricks wasn't in her new apartment 24 hours, though, before 2 police officers banged on the door. Apart from a few garbage bags filled with clothes, the 4-bedroom unit was bare. Everything else they'd owned had burned in the fire. Annie was lying on the floor, napping through the riot of noise created by her children, when the police entered. Quote, "Is this your apartment?" end quote, a lady cop demanded, assuming they were squatters. Boards still covered the windows. Annie handed over her lease. Quote, "All these children in here and no furniture," end quote, the officer said. Quote, "I could call Department of Children and Family Services on you," end quote. For the cop, Ricks was the embodiment of the Cabrini Green image, Denitra Vance's character in the flesh. For Ricks, the threat seemed almost comical. Quote, "I don't care what you call on me," end quote, she said. Quote, "I tried to get my children to DCFS. They wouldn't take them. These kids are well-dressed and taken care of," end quote. She snickered. At least she now had an apartment and was in the process of getting on public aid. She had to show the paperwork for that, too. Ricks used a voucher to pick out furniture at a store nearby that catered to families from Cabrini Green. She got bunk beds for the children, a kitchen table, and chairs. The cabinets were reattached, the boards removed from the windows. She painted the front room blue, the kitchen yellow, and the girls' bedroom pink. She laid tile in the kitchen. Annie's mother moved in with them, watching the children when Ricks worked, but Ernest didn't stay there, at least not officially. He and Annie hadn't married, and she didn't want to be disqualified from public aid. Quote, "If I had put him on my lease, my rent would have been sky high," end quote, Annie said. The lady cop returned to check on Ricks, and she saw the kitchen set in the beds, the new paint, and the light coming in through the windows. She nodded with approval. But that wasn't good enough for Annie. Quote, "Why are you going to say you're calling DCFS on me?" end quote, she asked. Quote, "You're a mother too. Why are you going to say that to me?" end quote. Unlike Ricks, Kelvin Cannon was well versed in Cabrini Green lore. As a lifelong resident and as a young man, he took a perverse pride in the cartoon depiction of his home. If the media helped form its iconic image as a world of utter deprivation and unrelenting violence, then saying you were from Cabrini projected a kind of power. You mugged into the funhouse mirror. You fed people the stories they wanted to hear about the murders, the gunfire, the beatings, the people lined up outside the high-rises to buy drugs. After Mayor Byrne added to its infamy, the name Cabrini Green was evoked to disparage anything as derelict or dangerous, from neighborhoods in other cities to a temporarily out-of-service elevator in a high-end apartment building. Cabrini Green became one of the stand-ins for the city itself, something people shouted in recognition when they heard the word, quote, Chicago, end quote, like Al Capone or Michael Jordan. A resident says in Project, quote, it's just automatic. When you say quote, it's just automatic. When you say Cabrini Green, people start freaking out. It's almost like a state of mind, end quote. When Cannon was a teenager, he'd be in lockup with hardened gang members from other parts of Chicago. A news story about his home would come on the television, and guys would treat him with respect, asking him if he ever had been inside the Rock or if it was true about the barrage of rifle fire on New Year's Eve. Quote, yeah, I've been over there, end quote, a man in the jail said to Cannon, as if describing a close call on a military tour. Quote, I'm never going back, end quote. On the set of Good Times, at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, the black cast members and the white producers argued about the portrayal of the show's Cabrini Green family. They debated authenticity and responsibility, which led to scouting trips to Chicago's near North Side. Esther Rowe, who played the Evans family matriarch, demanded that her character be married, the husband hardworking and present in his children's lives. She and the other actors insisted that the sitcom grapple with real social issues, gangs, welfare, racial discrimination in housing and employment. They wanted the episodes to focus more on the youngest Evans child, Michael, and his middle school protestations of black power. But the producers wanted more lines for JJ, James Jr., the eldest child, an out-of-work artist living at home, played by the comedian Jimmy Walker. Walker delivered his tagline as if possessed, slapping his hands, throwing back his head, and holding the pose, Dynamite! It was no contest. Jokes about the Nation of Islam lost out to Walker with his jelly-lean physical comedy and exaggerated minstrelsy, excuse me. Quote, I wanted to make my favorite sandwich today, peanut butter and jelly, end quote, JJ announces. Quote, but there wasn't no peanut butter and there wasn't no jelly, so I was forced to make a ghetto jam sandwich. 2 pieces of white bread jammed together, end quote. When Cannon saw Cooley High at the McIvers, Cabrini residents packed the downtown theater. They pointed out the familiar locations and the locals who'd been hired for small parts. Quote, it was an inspiration, end quote, Cannon recalled. The movie's main character, Preach, convinces a girl to go on a date with him, and the two of them stroll together over the Ogden Avenue Bridge, Kelvin's Bridge. Cannon would attend Cooley High himself, but the film was set in the pre-Lisperian times before the King riots and cop killings. The characters are members of the Cooley class of 1964, back when Kelvin was a baby. Preach, Coach Ice, and Pooter, wearing their cardigans and caps, look almost like they're out of Archie comics. They skip school to clown at the nearby Lincoln Park Zoo. They meet up at a local soda shop and join 2 gangbangers, played by real Cabrini gangbangers, to joyride through the loop. The movie seemed like an artifact, a portrait of all that had changed in a brief decade, in both the reality and the perception of Cabrini Green. The teens in the film aren't afraid that crime is their only option. They crave something more stimulating than the drudgery of low-skill factory jobs that are still there in abundance. Cannon grew up alongside Demetrius Cantrell, Sugar Ray Dinky, who made one of the first rap songs ever to come out of Chicago. The night in 1981, when the singer Larry Potts was murdered in the 1230 North Burling Rec Room, that was the end of the Electric Force Band. No way could they play after that. But Dinky continued to make music on his own. He'd rap about anything, verses streaming out of him about news events and sports figures and bits of advice. Oprah Winfrey visited Cabrini Green in the early 80s to feature the Jesse White tumblers. The fascination with crime and degradation there meant that the media focused also on the successes that seemed to blossom from the cracked asphalt. There were multiple news stories about Anthony Watson, who grew up in the row houses and became a Navy commander in charge of a nuclear submarine. Quote, rough selling, but he beats Cabrini's odds, end quote. And stories of teachers, tutoring programs, and entrepreneurs. As Oprah interviewed Jesse White outside Schiller School, the gym teacher interrupted her. Quote, hey, Dinky, end quote, he shouted as the young man passed by. Quote, come do that rap about Cabrini Green, end quote. Dinky did it on air, a cappella, a rap about the stench in the stairwells and the body he saw on the blacktop and the time someone fired 2 shotgun blasts through the front door of his apartment and what it was like to perform in a band there. He didn't know anyone at Cabrini Green, so he looked in the phone book and called a music producer watching wanted to record the song. He didn't know anyone at Cabrini Green, so he looked in the phone book and called a neighborhood liquor store. He asked if they knew about the kid who rapped on Oprah. Of course they did. They passed along the message, and Dinky went to a recording studio and did the song in a single take. Quote, Cabrini Green rap, end quote. Like other straightforward raps of the middle 80s, lands hard on the AA, BB end rhymes, marching ahead to the steady beat of synthesized drums. But the song is alive with the tragedy of a specific place that Dinky loves. In the thumbnail history, he rhymes, quote, Cabrini Green was built for the low income, so the people could live a little better than the bums, end quote. He relates how the lawns and flowers disappeared, how the development deteriorated and the name itself came to evoke an idea about cities in decline. Most of all, he conveys the particulars of a friend's murder, showing how violence remains singular and devastating, even when it's accepted as commonplace. Quote, I will never forget my man Larry Potts or the terrifying night that he got shot, end quote. And that is the end of chapter 6. I think what stands out to me from that chapter, or from the second half of the chapter that we read, is the police coming and knocking on the door, the family's door, and threatening to take her children away. Again, just a reminder of the specter of police terrorism that lingers over black people, that lingers over communities of color, and how that is just added or compounded on the psychological traumas that black people had already faced. I think another thing that is reminded is why, when, again, this is something that I read in the New Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander spoke about how commonly people speak about black men not being in the home, but how they don't take the time to speak about why black men aren't in the home. And here in this passage that we read, we seen another reason why black men weren't in the homes at times, and it's because black families would be penalized for a black man being in the home. She spoke about how she couldn't have the father of her children on the lease, even though that they were together and they were raising their children together, because her lease would go sky high and she couldn't afford it. And that's something that has to be spoken about, and that's something that has to be articulated as to why black women were being penalized and black families were being penalized for the black man being in the home. Another one of the things that stands out is, and this is something that we read about in Women, Race, and Class, and I've sort of spoke about it as we were reading in this book as well, I believe, but how entertainment, whether it be film or literature, books, music, whatever it may be, how it can reinforce negative stereotypes, even though it may also do a job of highlighting or bringing awareness to an issue, and why it's important that when you are doing something in entertainment to highlight or bring awareness to an issue, that you don't compromise and also end up enforcing or reinforcing stereotypes that exist with these issues. And so we see in Good Times that they wanted to speak about the specific issues that black people in Cabrini Green and Chicago were dealing with. They wanted to speak about, they wanted to highlight the youngest child and some of his beliefs, but that lost out to JJ making jokes. And that's something that's common a lot of times in film and entertainment, is a story being told that is supposed to be highlighting a plight that black people deal with, but in the midst of highlighting that plight, stereotypes are reinforced, prejudices are reinforced. And I just think that it's important that as we raise these next generations of people coming up, or even not even just raising generations of people who are presently creating and creators and artists, keep in mind the importance of not reinforcing those stereotypes. And then one of the things that we read in a previous book, in Cornel West's book, Race Matters, he speaks about the importance of the of black music and how instrumental black musicians and black artistry has been to the struggle for freedom and the struggle for liberation in America. He traced it back to songs that were sung during slave times that not only gave inspiration or motivation to continue to struggle on and to hope for a better day, but also had instructions of the Underground Railroad and instructions of when they were leaving and what routes they were taking when they were leaving. And he also speaks about how freedom songs were instrumental in the civil rights era and the civil rights movement that was going on. And we hear, and as we got to the end of this chapter, and the Cabrini Green rap songs that were taking place, or the Cabrini Green rap that the young man did, is a reminder of the importance of the black music, of music in the black culture, and how that has always been something that we have been able to find inspiration from and motivation from, but it has also been something that had instructions for survival. And so those are all some of the things that stand out to me from that chapter. We're a little bit over our 30-minute mark, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. Please take time to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if you haven't before. And if by the time you listen to this, there's future episodes out, please go and listen to those as well. Again, we do these readings and release them daily to provide people the opportunity to continue or to begin their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holler at you tomorrow.